Hi, everybody. So, welcome to History 5A World War II Part 2, Part 2. So, we're going to finish this war with this lecture. I have my two drinks lined up, ready to go. And I hope you guys are all well and doing good. And I mentioned in the last lecture, there's some readings I did not assign to you, but there's some very good ones tied to subjects I'm going to talk about in the next few minutes. I recommend to you guys. So don't limit yourself just to what I have assigned. There's some other relatively short reads, but very helpful reads I recommend to you guys. So, okay. All right, so let's pick up where we left off. And so in this massive topic, we're going to try to boil it down to a few specific final incidents to give you a sense of the war, and maybe some topics you can pursue more on your own if you have that interest. And then we'll get to the end. So you see U.S., England, Russia, uneasy allies. It's absolutely true. We've not talked about diplomacy much at all in these lectures because World War II is such a massive topic. But as you guys know, United States, England, and Russia are all allies in this war, and there's zero trust. Famously, as you know, these world leaders, Stalin and Churchill and Roosevelt, do meet a number of times to plan out both A, how to win the war, and then B, what does the post-war world look like. There's not much cooperation. There's a bit. I talked about Land-Lease at the very end of the last lecture. And there is certainly assistance given to Russia, and certainly Russia is carrying a heavy burden in the fighting. But as far as any more cooperation than that, there's not a lot of it. They don't, neither side likes each other nor trust each other. And as the war progresses and Russia gets upper hand after Kursk and remaining battles from the summer of 43 to the end in May 45, as Russia grows more and more powerful and begins to expel the Nazi armies from Russian soil and then into Eastern Europe, with liberation from the Nazi boot, they get the Soviet boot. Again, between the two of them, I'd probably have to choose the Soviet boot in most cases, but it is a boot nonetheless, and that is going to begin, in many ways, the beginning of the Cold War. So liberation from Nazi fascism is good, but it's replaced by Russian totalitarianism. Not good. Although, again, probably preferable, but not good. Not what those nations wanted. Not the self-determination those nations wanted. Okay. Let's move on to winning with high-tech weapons. And I'll move fairly quickly through this section, but just how the modern world is emerging from World War II. All sides are working on various weapons. I'm going to focus on some German ones, just because it's a sign of the times. Obviously, the U.S. is working on the most powerful weapons, of course, which is the atomic bomb. The Russians were working on that too, but fortunately, the Russians were very hard behind that. The Germans are working on it, also behind. Japanese working on a nuclear weapon, also, thank God, behind. But the Germans were not behind when it came to rocketry. They had the best missiles in the world by far. The German scientists produced the world's first ballistic missile, which you see in front of you, which is the V-2 ballistic missile. In World War II times, this thing was impossible to intercept because it's a missile, goes up in the stratosphere, comes down, no warning, impossible to intercept. It just simply arrives. Fortunately, the Germans did not have a lot of these, and they could only put conventional or regular warheads on these kind of missiles. Still, it is a terrifying preview of the future world that we'd know in the Cold War, the threat of nuclear war, and there remains to this day with North Korea, as you guys know, very busily working on their new and improved ballistic missile program to shake their fist at the world and maintain their police state there in North Korea and assert their power and their place in the sun of the world through the missile program. So what the Germans are doing in World War II is really an opening chapter of what the world has dealt with since then, which is a very new form of weapon, which is the ballistic missile. The German V-1 was a much more primitive attempt at a terror weapon. It's not a ballistic missile, it's a guided missile. It's not particularly fast, although by World War II standards it was pretty fast. But it's basically the speed of a fast plane. So you, in theory, could shoot them down. They weren't piloted, so they did fly in a straight line, so anti-aircraft guns did shoot quite a few down. The fast British American fighters could all shoot them down too, because again, they just fly straight. There's no pilot, so that's autopilot. But again, a signifier of technologies to come with attacks through some kind of missile system on large civilian population centers, as we're seeing right now the Russians doing with the Ukrainians. There's the V2 taking off. Of course, the ultimate trump card in the worst kind of way, in terror kind of way, would be the U.S. atomic bombs. The U.S., out of all these weapon systems, comes up with the most astronomically terrifying and damaging and decisive, which is nuclear weapons. The Germans did come up with the world's first operational jet fighter, Messerschmitt 262, which was light years ahead of its allied propeller-driven aircraft. Fortunately, Germans had relatively few numbers of those, and they arrived too late to make any real difference besides being an obvious scare factor. But there was not that many, so they did not arrive in numbers that would have changed the outcome of the war. Thank God. Germans are also taking other very high-tech aspects too. This is the Messerschmitt 169 Comet. This was a rocket plane. Not very successful in combat, probably more dangerous to its own pilot than it was to Allied bombers, but the idea was you could take off using the rocket. You can go completely vertical because it is a rocket, so you don't need to use a regular propeller engine or even the very new technology jet engine. It's a rocket, so you can go vertical, and the idea was this small fighter could take off vertically, get up to the American bombing streams, and be able to shoot down a bomber or two, hopefully before it runs out of its rocket. There's very few of these. They killed more of their own crew members trying to fly this radical new cutting-edge conception that did American bomber crews, fortunately, and essentially made no difference in the war. But again, it's a signifier of radical new technologies coming along that are going to change the world that we're still grappling with now in 2023. Same thing for this earlier jet bomber. Germans had only a few of these. They were quite fast, very difficult for the Allies to intercept. But the Germans had very few of them. Again, it doesn't really matter that late in the war, the very few number they had. Well, a couple last depictions. This one actually never got into combat. This is a German flying wing they're working on. It's called the Horten flying wing. It only existed in mock-up. They might have had one or two that flew a little bit, but never got into combat. So the image you see there is a fanciful image. Never got into combat, never got operational. But again, it was just a game changer because, ironically, that has stealth qualities. And that was not on the Germans' mind when they made it, by the way. But it turns out, decades later, U.S. scientists working on the world's first stealth fighter went to the Smithsonian Museum in Washington, D.C. because they knew that the Germans had this flying wing they could show at the end of the war. And although the Germans were not able to get it operational or even close to that, it was a revolutionary design. Americans looked at it, incorporated parts from that generalized design into both our stealth fighter and ultimately stealth bomber. If you look at our stealth bombers today, they look very similar to that Horten German flying wing you see depicted right there. Finally, the Germans even talk about making a space plane. There's no way they could do this in World War II. Any pilot that would have been crazy enough to try this would have died, absolutely. But the fact that they're even contemplating something like this, again, think something like the space shuttle. Again, they were not there yet. This is strictly things written on paper. There's no way they could have made this with the technology they had. Just would not have worked. Would have killed anybody who tried, probably blown up on the pad. But again, just a signifier of the modern world that you and I would begin to recognize today with technologies in their infancy during late in the war. Are things that we are still dealing with today in one form or another, or pushing in similar frontiers, which lets you know what a watershed moment World War II comes, even when it comes to technology. Okay. Shifting gears, although showing from those planes, this is a similar, and that is an important topic to deal with World War II and any war, frankly, of how do you win a war, a savage war, without losing your own sense of morality when you're fighting against a ruthless opponent. I think there's probably always been a moral quandary in warfare that's always existed, which is you may be fighting a savage opponent that has few moral qualms about level of killing that they are willing to do, targeting civilians, just the brutality that they're engaged in. How do you win that war without following down that same path of a moral whirlpool to the darkness by joining them in similar levels of barbarity because you're outraged and want to win the war too? And that's a good question for World War II. That's going to affect the Allies. The Axis, maybe not so much because the Axis, was not in a terrifying way. I let you know what the fascism like. The Axis was not particularly concerned. Spent a long time worrying about this equation. As you know, fascist powers, above all, gave importance to the host nation, not that concerned to other nations. So when it comes to gross inhumanity and so forth, the fascists in general, whether that be in Japan, Germany, Italy, but especially Germany and Japan, are not losing a lot of sleep on the blood that's left on their hands, the death count from killing civilians, massacres, etc. Because their racist ideology, their desire for dominance, so social dominance, survival of the fittest, etc. All that fits them to not be particularly worried on, to say the least. That's the most understated, is to say not particularly worried. But often some genocidal policies toward the conquered, not worried about this topic in general. Individual Germans, Japanese, of course, are, but in general, their fascist governments are not. And that brings up strategic bombing and the brutal nature of war. War has always been brutal. In the more modern world, last several hundred years, there has been a concept of just war. Maybe it'll be a little longer than that. And there's been, and there's been an attempt by, I say, some nations with the Nuremberg Treaty and so forth to try to limit just the ferocity of the war and its impact on civilians. So there has been attempts to, I don't say regulate, but I suppose limit the worst excesses of warfare and its horrific impact on civilians. And I would say that's especially true more of Western Europe, probably, to have some kind of more developed sense of guidelines of what is okay and what is not okay in warfare. At the start of World War II, both Germany and Japan showed a very early ruthlessness that they were not particularly concerned with abiding by any kind of abstract moral rules when it came to dealing with warfare in general, civilian populations, and the enemy other. The Spanish Civil War is famous for that. The German intentional bombing, the Italians were there too. The city of Guernica, made famous by Picasso's painting of that event. The shock of the world of a massive bombing raid on a relatively small civilian population, but a civilian population focused in a city, and the German and Italian Air Force wiping out at least the inner core of that city and killing many civilians. The total numbers that are killed in that tragic bombing raid in the Spanish Civil War are going to pale in comparison to what's going to happen in World War II, as you can imagine. But that shock and anger at the intentional barbarity of the Germans and the Italians, and of course, equally in Japan too. Japanese indiscriminate bombing of Chinese civilian centers, massacre of Chinese, has made the long kind of dark claws of aerial bombing visible to the world. And the fear that what this could do on an even larger scale is omnipresent. Germany and Japan were roundly criticized by the Allies or the larger world for, again, intentionally bombing civilian populations. Of course, the reason why the Germans do that is they see them as a military target. We can also terrorize local population. We can demoralize them. Weaken their will to fight, help us win the war more quickly. During the Battle of Britain, of course, and even earlier fighting in Belgium and so forth, the fighting in Poland, the Germans had showed very little compunction about outright targeting large civilian sections. Sometimes intentionally do that. The Japanese absolutely do that in China too. In general, the Allies looked at that with shock and horror because, again, they're intentionally targeting civilian areas of these cities. There's not even a lot of effort made to target only military targets. The civilian population is clearly a prime target that the Germans and also Japanese in Asia are targeting. There's a lot of criticism of that, a lot of moral hand-wringing. And then as the war progresses, though, the British and later on the Americans begin to get involved in heavy strategic bombing as well. In the start of the fighting, Britain initially tried to bomb German cities during the day. That way they could specifically target specific like airplane factories or tank factories or naval base, etc. But the cost in shot down British bombers soon led the British to give up on the idea that we can fly there in the daytime during daylight and cope with the German fighters. So instead, the British shift to night raids. But night raids in World War II, precision is largely impossible, certainly difficult, if not impossible. So at a certain point, it's always called what you call mission creep. Mission creep is you have an idea what you're going to do, and then you kind of bit by bit, it gets bigger and bigger and bigger. At a certain point, Bomber Command in the RAF decides we're just going to shift to and target and hold German cities in the night because we cannot accurately bomb a small portion of that city that maybe had military factories. Let's just bomb the city itself. Now, again, they didn't invent the wheel. Germany had been doing this. Battle of Britain clearly is a good example of that. As long as other bombing campaigns by Germany already. But now Great Britain is joining the German policy of simply targeting mass portions of the civilian population. The Americans, for most of the early part of the war, did high-altitude daytime targeted bombing, and were not as comfortable bombing whole cities. But that will also change. So the farther you get in the war, the more aware the Americans ourselves that we are also willing to simply target mass civilian populations with our air raids too. Whole cities become targets. And Americans participate in this carpet bombing, fire bombing, just like the British are doing. Because of the size of the war effort, because of the size of modern technologies, bombers, the extraordinary killing potential, destructive potential of these bombers grows exponentially. So by late in the war, these American British bombers can just rain down, because they fly over by the hundreds, they can rain down just an extraordinary level of high explosives and or incendiaries used to design to start fires. In which case you get terrible, iconic fires that can sweep through certain German cities during the war. Now in Asia, of course, too, but we're not going to focus on Asia since it's the European history class. But it certainly happened in Japan and other places. But that painting in front of you see British heavy bombers at night over German cities. You see a night fighter. There's a German night fighter just floating up trying to shoot down these bombers. And you can see beneath them, the city is just on fire, representing, again, the burning of German cities later in the war by the Royal Air Force. And the United States also participating to some degree. And these lead to terrible, terrible firestorms. Obviously Hiroshima and Nagasaki are the most famous of the Allied bombing attacks on the Axis. But the firebombing in Dresden in Germany killed around anywhere from 22 to 25,000 Germans in that raid, most of them civilians because the large city is simply being targeted. Now, the numbers are not as big, of course, as Hiroshima, but they are just still stunning numbers. And other German cities will bear that brunt too. You see depictions right there of Dresden here on the right. Many parts of it largely burned out. On the left here, you can see aftermath of German policemen and volunteers trying to collect bodies in the terrible rubber destroyed section of Dresden. Along with this photograph right here, which is a really just stunning photograph. These are partially burned bodies of residents of Dresden. Some of them probably died from smoke inhalation from these firestorms created by these thousands of British incinerators that are dropped on Dresden at night, and it turns into this massive fire cyclone. Or cyclones. That photograph there shows bodies piled there waiting to be cremated as Germany grapples with the mass deaths of these bombing campaigns. Of course, and the point of all that is, at what point do we, in our desire to win the war, do we begin employing the worst human decision-making bloody mining tactics that we only a few years earlier castigated, perhaps rightly so, the Germans, Japanese for doing, and now we have gone to that same level. I'm not saying it's exactly the same. That's a big topic. I just want to bring it up to you guys because it's an important piece to chew on. It's also a warning for all nations. I'm not saying those bombing campaigns were necessarily wrong, but they certainly weren't a nightmare, and you certainly trading in very dangerous territory. And one of the reads you guys read about this. Hold on, let me bring up the title for the piece you guys read. You guys read Margit Freier's They Fainted and Burned Like Cinders. That's talking about a terrible firebombing in German cities. To give you guys a very visceral example of what we're talking about. And it certainly is a good warning for us now, too, to realize we have military systems, but to always look at the cost of the use of those systems and never losing sight of our own morality as a nation as we fight a war. And there's no easy way to fight a war. Understand that wars are complicated, wars are bloody, innocents die in war. It's part of the horrible nature of war. But how do you, as a nation with a moral core, how do you differentiate between unavoidable casualties and excessive casualties because we've grown used to a dark system and we participate in that? I'll let you guys parse through your own conclusions on top of that because it is a big one and there's multi-sides to that. All right, let's move on. So I want you guys to be familiar with me. Highlight this for you guys. Here we go. The Warsaw Uprising, which is going to convulse Warsaw, Poland in the summer of 1944. I want you to give you guys a minute to write that down. So the Polish uprising, the Polish underground home army rise up to kick out the Nazis, hoping to create a free Polish government before Stalin can impose a communist puppet government. Kind of a mouthful for a title, but it is a pretty good one. So by the summer of 44, the Russian army has the German army on the run, and it's pushed deeply into Poland and is on the outskirts nearly of Warsaw. Many Poles who had quietly suffered under the German occupation but have been looking for a chance to kick the Germans out feel that this is the best moment to do that. The German army is in retreat. Perhaps we can rise up, seize control of Warsaw as the Germans are retreating through. Now, why would you do that? Why would you simply wait for the Russian army to arrive? Because they could. And the reason why they don't want to wait for the Russian army to arrive is the Poles have been treated horribly by the Germans. Well, that is true. They have been treated horribly by the Germans, but they've also been treated very badly by previously Imperial Russia, but also Lenin's Russia and Stalin's Russia. So the Poles are deeply afraid if they wait for the Russians to liberate them. Certainly the Russians would kick out the Nazis. Good, exceptionally good, as you guys, because Hitler's view of Poland is exceptionally dark. But Stalin and the Bolsheviks also were not interested in what is best for Poland. They certainly want to take over Poland and make Poland part of the Soviet Union and incorporate it whether Poland wants to or not. Aware of this, as the Germans are retreating, many Poles, proud of their nation, hopeful to regain independence, do not want to wait till the Red Army arrives and have some kind of puppet Stalinist pro-communist government installed upon them. They don't want that. They want their own independent nation, understandably. So their plan was, as the Germans retreating, the Germans are nearly gone, we'll kick out the remaining Germans. We will then be free and we can declare ourselves an independent Polish nation reborn. And when the Red Army rolls in, it's going to be awful hard for them to take back the clock and install a puppet government because we will already have selected our own free, independent Polish government, and Stalin will be forced to recognize it instead of simply trying to do some sleight of hand and impose his communist puppet government upon us. That painting artwork in front of you is a good example of just intense street fighting there in the Warsaw Uprising. You see a barricade right here. These are the Polish Home Guard right here. Wearing a variety of different uniforms, some having German helmets and parts uniform. And these guys right here too with the armband, the color of the flag of Poland, red and white. And you can see a German tank here, German infantry storming forward dealing with this barricade right here. That's a very good example of just the intensity of the fighting there in Warsaw. Some other examples. Oops, there we go. Again, Polish Home Guard there on the left, and on the right, you can see the very young nature of quite a few of the Polish Home Guard soldiers. These boys, I would not call them men because they're too young, they're not men yet. These young boys are also involved in the fighting. The fighting turns out to be a very heroic and catastrophic moment for Poland. To this day, Poland looks with great pride and admiration on the brave Polish Home Guard, who, with relatively few weapons, rose up against the might of the German army, and for over a month, almost 6 weeks, gave the Germans a real run for their money and control of Warsaw. Now, tragically, ultimately, Hitler would crush the Polish uprising, and most of them would die either in the fighting or in concentration camps or in the aftermath of at the end of the war when they were forced to surrender or captured. I'm going to give you guys a little bit of some numbers here when this took place in summer of 44. You see, uprising coincided with the retreat of the German army, but unfortunately, the Germans had not quite left. They were retreating, but had not quite left Poland. Now, I mentioned there being, here, let me highlight this for you guys. Actually, a couple things I want to highlight to you guys. Actually, all of this. So take a minute so you guys can write all this down. Just as an overview, during the course of the fighting, of the 6 weeks intense fighting and the aftermath, around 200,000 Poles will be killed. In Warsaw, both the Home Guard, the soldiers, but also the vast majority of those will be citizens. Civilians. I'm sorry, not citizens, civilians. Quite a few German soldiers died in this too. About 25,000 German soldiers are killed in this fighting too. Now, the Poles had hoped when they rose up that perhaps Stalin's armies, which were, by the way, close enough that they could hear the guns of the Russian army, that perhaps once the fighting started, that the Red Army could again push on the front lines, and the Red Army could arrive in Warsaw relatively quickly, perhaps within days, if they chose to. Instead, Stalin, not wanting to deal with an independent Polish government and wanting to be able to install his own puppet government, does nothing and allows the Germans all the time they need to crush the Warsaw uprising. Now, once it's crushed, his armies are given the command to move forward again, and then they will liberate what is left, which is not much, most of it is shell, but will liberate Warsaw. Could Stalin have intervened much quicker? Undoubtedly, he could have. Undoubtedly, he chose intentionally not to go to the aid of the Warsaw uprising because, again, he does not want to have to deal with an independent, heroic Polish community, which would be the natural leaders of a new independent Poland. He wants a Poland that's under the thumb of under his own thumb, and that is controlled by a pro-communist puppet government. So, Red armies don't move. Russian tanks, all that sits silently as Germans have those 6 weeks to finally batter, bludgeon, and burn their way to the end of the Polish uprising. I mentioned Stalin's history there. I want you guys to know an example of this. So, and actually, it's probably better in one of my first lectures in World War II. But as you guys know, when the Germans invaded Poland from the west, the Russians invaded from the east, and the Russians are going to take eastern Poland. Stalin and the Russians have bad blood with the Poles. It goes back a long ways. There's a lot to that story. I'm not going to get to all that. I just talk about the very most recent parts of it. Perhaps you guys remember Lenin had attempted to use the Red Army to take over Poland. That book I recommended to you when you're talking about Ukraine history, Isaac Babel's Red Cavalry, talks about some of that fight between the Red Army and the Poles. Actually, that book is primarily about that topic between the Bolshevik Red Army and the Polish army. Well, in that 1919-1920 conflict between Bolshevik Russia and Poland, the Poles are actually going to win that conflict and maintain their independence as an independent nation, which would last up to World War II, when, as you guys know, they're invaded by both sides, by the Germans and the Russians, and Poland is divided between them. So, but the fact that the Poles look back on that glorious defense of their early republic against the Bolshevik invasion in 1919 and 1920 is a source of pride. Now, obviously, with 39, when the Russians move in, the Germans move in, they're no longer independent. And Stalin, looking at the Poles again with a lot of distrust, think the Poles are very strongly anti-Bolshevik, anti-communist, which, by the way, there's quite a bit of truth in that. He's not wrong about some of that. Decides that following the end of fighting and the German and Russian invasion, Stalin decides to eliminate the officer class from the Polish army that he captured in the eastern portion of Poland, and he will do that. So Russian military officers, the NKVD, are going to massacre around 22,000 Polish military officers and leading intellectual thinkers, writers, politicians, professors, etc., who are just massacred secretly by the NKVD and buried in mass graves. That would have been April, May of 1940. Now, the reason why I bring that up is the context. You can see why the Poles went and desperately kick out the Nazis, but are not excited by the prospect of the Russians arriving and replacing them, even though maybe the colonization might be, colonization, the occupation might not be as ferocious. It's still going to be quite dark and bad, as evidenced by these complete war crimes of massacring these Polish army officers in large numbers. That mass grave is discovered in 1943. It was exhumed, ironically, with German help, because Germans are still controlling Poland, and the Poles rightly blamed the Russians for this. Now, Germany's hands are full of blood too, as you guys know, and the treatment of Poles was abysmal. So the Germans are last able to point the hand at someone. So when the Germans actually found these massacre sites, the Germans blamed it on the Russians, which was correct. But the world is so jaded by that time period when the Germans are pointing out that the Russians conducted these massacres of Polish army officers, intellectuals, and so forth. Most of the world ignored those Nazi claims and believed that they're fraudulent based on all the blood the Nazis had on their hands, which is absolutely true. But this is one of the few times when Nazis are pointing out someone else's atrocity and actually is correct. That photograph right there shows you the parts of Warsaw with the uprising, where the Home Guard was able to take over those portions of the city there in western Warsaw. That map on the left shows various Waffen SS officers preparing to get ready to assault a part of Warsaw to take the city back from the Polish Home Army. Some of those individuals in that photograph you see there on the right are going to be charged with very, very serious war crimes, including mass atrocities, as we'll see here in a minute. So, once you guys know this one, let me highlight this for you guys. The Wola Massacre. So, after the start of the Warsaw Uprising, once Hitler got wind of what was taking place and the size and the ferocity of the uprising in the Polish capital city, Warsaw, Hitler does not want this to spread to any more of Poland or beyond in other occupied nations. So Hitler decides, using utmost brutality, we're going to terrorize the citizens of Warsaw as a warning to any other people who are thinking perhaps of potentially mounting some uprising. So a number of SS units and other auxiliary security force units, some of them composed of people from the worst kind of backgrounds, convicts, people with discipline problems, etc., are used to break into the western part of Warsaw that had briefly been under the Polish Home Guard control. They break in. Hitler tells them, I don't care what you have to do. And Hitler's part of this too, as head of the SS. Tells them, I want you to teach the Poles a lesson, and also as a warning to anyone else among the captured territories or occupied territories who's thinking about rising up in resistance, what's going to happen to you. And the Wola Massacre is just that. That is these SS units and security assistance units going through these western suburbs of Warsaw and just simply killing everybody they found. Men, women, children, does not matter whether they're participating in that uprising or not. They simply break in the house and start shooting people. Or took them to a railroad station near there, and around 10,000 were executed at that railroad station. Whether you were involved in the uprising or not, just simply the fact that you're in this neighborhood led to their massacre. We don't know the numbers exactly. They remain under controversy even now, but fairly reliable numbers are 40 to 50,000 Poles are massacred there in the larger Wola neighborhood. There's much more to that story, the heroism of the fighters. I would highly recommend to you guys in your textbook on page 243, there's a piece there by Bor Komorowski called The Uprising, 1944. So if you guys want to get a first-hand account of what I was just talking about in much more detail, I'd highly recommend that to you guys as well. I put this chart here to give you guys some context of the agony Poland goes through in the war. Um, Poland loses more percentage-wise than any other nation in World War II, a percentage of civilians and military killed. And that you can see why that is, because you have two systems, Nazi fascism and Soviet totalitarianism, both of them invading into Poland, occupying Poland, and Poland suffers immensely from both sides. Look at the blue line. The blue line there is total deaths as a percentage of the population. And you see no nation is even that close, although the Soviet Union and Lithuania are not too far behind. But as far as just absolute percentage of the population that is killed. But it is also useful to look at the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union by far has the most citizens killed than any nation, although China is not far behind. And those numbers are not perfect either. China, just all the numbers, China's could be even higher. But that one's probably pretty good. Anyways, Russia and China have the greatest number of people killed, both civilians, also in the military. But Poland has by far the greatest percentage population killed. That's the vast number of civilians that are killed in the initial invasion, the occupation, the Holocaust, and then in the liberation of Poland, which involves the Warsaw Uprising and so forth. Poland just suffers immense losses of life during World War II. And give me a second here. Whoops, there we go. I don't know why. Hold on. That's better. Okay. So I'll recommend some sources to you guys on the Warsaw Uprising, besides obviously your textbook. But it's a fascinating topic, an important one. It plays a big role in how Poland looks at the world currently. We're talking currently, and why Poland is so readily willing to help out Ukraine, even though I mentioned way back in previous lectures that there have been some ethnic cleansing and massacres during World War II between Poland and Ukraine. In World War I, there was savage fighting between what areas we know today as Ukraine and Poland. So not that far back, Poland and Ukrainians' relationship was awful, just awful. But in our current context, based on the Russian invasion of Ukraine, Ukraine and Poland are quite close as, I'd almost call them some degree allies. And why is that? For the obvious reason is Russia. They're able to put aside their own bloody, painful history with the two of them because they're facing a massive threat just to the east, which Ukraine is feeling directly through invasion and war, and Poland is highly alarmed and worried about that same possibility. And so Poland's been quite generous currently in helping out Ukraine because they both have a very menacing same enemy. It's back to the Warsaw Uprising. That book, 1944, by Alexander Ritchie, would be a very good choice. Maybe your first place to go. That book by Norman Davies is also very good. Norman Davies has done extensive work as a historian on Poland in general. So if you're curious about Poland, want to know more about Poland, Norman Davies would be a good choice because he's written many books on Polish history. But that's his version of the Warsaw Uprising, also a very good choice. The Eagle Unbowed talked about the Poles in general in the Second War. That's a bit of a larger picture of Poland. For example, the Free Poles who were able to escape Poland and come to the West and fight on behalf of the West. What happened inside Poland, there's a lot there in that story. So that's a larger narrative how Poland got through the entire war. Roger Moorhouse's Poland 1939, the outbreak of World War II. And of course, that would be in Poland. So if you want to go back and kind of review what was Poland, epicenter of this terrible war in Poland at the start, would be a good choice. Timothy Snyder, I mentioned him way back early in the semester, talked about Ukraine, and as a recommendation, his YouTube lectures on Ukrainian history are excellent. I recommend this to you guys. I know it's been a while since we talked about that, but I recommend it. But he's a brilliant historian. He wrote his classic book, Bloodlands, the year between Hitler and Stalin. Again, if you want the kind of larger context before the war, but gives you context what's going to happen in the context of our class, which is the Warsaw Uprising, but give you an idea of both how Eastern Europe is trapped between these two giants, and you see these two storms brewing in the west and the east. That's going to engulf Eastern Europe and Poland in particular. Norman Davies' book there, White Eagle, Red Star, that is the Polish Soviet War, which I talked about here just a few minutes ago. In Polish eyes, it's a great moment of national pride because they stopped the communist Bolshevik invasion of Poland, and Poland remained free. It's a major event for world history, by the way, because if Poland would have fallen under the Bolshevik boot, to use that analogy, perhaps Germany would have been next. And there was a strong communist movement within Germany. Perhaps Central European history would have been quite different. But instead, the Bolshevik military expansion is stopped very successfully, although not without a high cost, by Poland in 1919-1921. Stalin's words by Sean McKim would be a good choice, how Stalin views all these things, in this case context, Poland in general, but also the Warsaw Uprising. That book by Adam Zamorsky, Poland, a History. Again, this is a deep dive, but if you want to understand Poland in its larger context, both the glory days and also its descent in this very rough history for the last several hundred years, that book would be a very good choice. And finally, one final recommendation, if you would like to read about the Warsaw Uprising and want something that's digestible so you get a good feel for those terrible and also heroic events there. But you think, I can't make my way through 600 pages right now. This is a publication called Offspray Publication. They do a very good job with military history, and this book is only around 100 pages with a lot of pictures and maps. But I don't say that in a negative way, in a very good way. So it gives you a very good, relatively quick read to get a good overall idea of what took place there. And then if you're more curious, then you can do a much deeper dive with one of these books up here by Alexander Ritchie, for example, or Norman Davies, Rising 44. And there's others, of course, too. I just mentioned a couple. If movies or TV is more accessible to you, I recommend highly the one on the left, Uprising. I bet you Netflix or Amazon has that, although I don't know. Warsaw Uprising is much more recent, but that also be a good choice. Warsaw 44, another recent movie that I think both of these are Polish. This is done by an American or British film production crew. I believe both of these, Warsaw Uprising and Warsaw 44, I believe those are both Polish productions. And then the movie The Pianist. Some of you might have seen The Pianist. The Pianist talks about the Holocaust kind of in general of Poland, but its main character is going to witness both the Jewish ghetto uprising in Warsaw, which I've not talked about in this lecture, even though it's a prelude to the 1944 uprising, which is the Polish Home Guard. But equally heroic is the refusal of the remaining Jews in the Warsaw ghetto to calmly accept their fate going to the death camps. And they also rise up, in many ways inspiring the later 1944 uprising. But the movie The Pianist does a very good job of showing both those uprisings. By true story, so it's an amazing story. If you've not seen The Pianist, I cannot recommend that movie highly enough to you for the variety of things it does. It shows you the start of the war. Obviously, the Holocaust, the main character was a brilliant Jewish pianist, but also how this affects Poland in general, the betrayal, the Jewish ghetto, the German attempts to liquidate the ghetto's uprising, and then later on the Home Guard uprising in 1944, and then even the aftermath of what happens to Warsaw. Because Hitler's enraged, even though, frankly, the German military did not have the strength to be wasting time with this insane brutality toward the Poles, but they do. They don't have time for this. They should be fighting the Red Army, in theory, right? You're losing the war. Why are you wasting German, planes and tanks and ammunition, soldiers and lives to level Warsaw? How does that advance your war? Well, it actually does advance Hitler's war aims, I suppose, in a sense it does. It makes militarily zero sense. But in the Nazi worldview, I suppose it does make sense, because you guys know Hitler despised the Poles as being subhuman. So the fact that in the final days of German occupation, you want to kill as many as you can and level their capital, in the devil's kind of way, I guess it makes horrible sense, because that's what Nazism is about. All right, we're getting close in this lecture, the bloody end in Nazi Germany final battles. So both the Western Allies, the British, the Americans, the Free French, are pushing steadily into Germany from the West, even though the failure of the Battle of Operation Market Garden, which we talked about in the previous lecture. But the Americans and the British, the Free French, recover from that and go on to push. And despite the Battle of the Bulge and all of that takes place, the Americans and the British continue to push into close to Berlin, as you see here on the map here on the left. There's Berlin right there. You can see the Western Allies pushing deeply into Germany. And from the east, you can see the Red Army pouring into eastern Germany, the last remnants of Poland and so forth, and moving to the outskirts of Berlin and ultimately up to Berlin itself. And that takes us to our final topic here as we're wrapping up World War II, and that is the final death struggle in Berlin. The Western Allies decided to let Stalin, the Red Army, take Berlin. They probably could have if they would have pushed hard. Probably the British and Americans and the French probably could have got to Berlin first if they really wanted to. But Berlin is in eastern Germany. So I suppose in some ways it makes sense for the Russians to take it. It is in eastern Germany. It also is going to be an extraordinarily bloody battle. And perhaps the Western Allies, rightly or wrongly, decided we'll let Stalin do that. The amount of dead American, Free French, and British boys, etc., taking Berlin. Why don't we let the Russians do that in eastern Germany in any case? And that's what's going to take place. And that takes place from April 16 to May 2, when finally resistance stops in Berlin and the war ends shortly. It was a terrible conflict there in Berlin. We're not really going to break down the fighting, but yeah, terrible fighting. And I think I did not assign those readings to you guys. I think I mentioned it in the past one, but in your textbook, if you want to know just the kind of nightmare to come, I recommend this in the book, page 249, The End of the Reich. And there's a series of readings about liberating the death camps there, but also just the arrival of the late war. Joseph Goebbels, morale of the German people is both at home and front, sinking ever lower. That's Goebbels' worry about what's taking place. And then the Charles Fuhrmans in the ruins of the burning city, SS men, the Hitler Youth were holding out fanatically. Yep, that's right. The typical German army unit realized the war's over. Now, some did fight very hard in Berlin, but the most dangerous, even to German civilians, are going to be the Hitler Youth and SS, who, to the last moment, are executing fellow Germans who are not fighting hard enough or resisting or whatever the case may be. And the nightmare continues. And then the Russians push in, and that is Marie Nauman's We're in the Hands of the Mob, which starts on page 261. I'd highly recommend that read to you guys. I did not assign it to you guys. But that is the mass rapes and killings conducted by the Red Army as they push into Germany and Berlin in particular, but Germany in general. The savagery of the fighting on the Eastern Front, we talked about that in the previous lecture, on both sides. Both sides are like to take prisoners. Both sides treated their prisoners, for example, German treatment of Russian prisoners, Russian treatment of German prisoners. Both of them are appalling. Both of them are mass war crimes on both sides. When the Russian soldiers get into eastern Germany and then to Berlin itself, after all the terrible fighting in Berlin, mass rapes are common, summary executions, etc. Of course, not all Russian army units do that, depends who the commanders are, but it is quite common and widespread. Now, to be fair in a sense, of course, as you guys know, Russia has gone through a nightmare, terrible atrocities, rapes, murders, etc., taking place when the German army is in Russia. So the worst of those two thought systems, the darkness of fascism and its racialized view of the Slavic people and the inhumanity of that view and what it means for its occupation, its warfare, its destruction of civilians. And then on the flip side, the anger of the Russians in response, the very fighting for their survival as a people. And then you laid on top, to some degree, the Soviet philosophy, the brutality of their own military to their own soldiers, the degradation they experience, and to some degree Stalinism. All that pulls into together that their treatment of the Germans is also horrific when they move into Eastern Germany and Berlin. The casualties on both sides are massive. Russian dead, at least, we don't know the total number, but after that, just days and days and days and the weeks of door-to-door fighting, probably at least 80,000 Russians died in their conquest of Berlin. German dead, anywhere from 80 to 100,000 are killed in the conflict. The German army, of course, defending Berlin is by this time period relatively small. But despite that, they're very hard fighting. You can see how desperate the Germans are here at the end of the war. That photograph shows an old retiree with a German anti-tank rocket. That picture left shows a dug-in German tank trying to defend one of the city streets there in Berlin. More examples of that. I see on the left, there's a German tank there dug in. You can see that tank was operational for quite a while. You can see all the spent shell casings around that tank. But of course, there's not many German tanks anymore, but there's sure a lot of Russian tanks. On the right, you see Russian tanks shoving their way into Berlin. This would be downtown Berlin. These are the major government buildings. In fact, that might be the Reichstag there in the background. You can see these Russian tanks moving into central Berlin. And more examples of that as the Red Army slams, bashes, blasts its way into the crumbling, burning ruins of Berlin, ultimately raising the red flag over the German capital building, the Reichstag. And that brings that terrible battle to an end, and World War II in Europe to an end, with the final German surrender there, with the death of Hitler, his suicide in the bunker. As you guys are probably already familiar, in Germany, it's exhausted, and they've had enough, and his admiral that succeeds Hitler says enough is enough, and they sit down, and the war, that terrible, terrible war, is brought to an end. If you guys want to know more about this war, and that requires a strong stomach, specifically the fall of Berlin, and you guessed it, it's Anthony Beevor, one more time. His Fall of Berlin is a classic, though. So if you want to read about this terrible battle, that would be a good choice. And that book on the right, Ivan's War, by Catherine Meredale, although she's actually, I think she's simply, well, anyways, that would be a very, if you want to get kind of a firsthand what's it like to be a Russian soldier in this terrible war. I recommended some sources on some German soldiers, but to get an idea what it's like to be a Russian soldier, typical soldier in this terrible war, that would be a very good choice as well, too. And there's many, many other books, but I think we're going to come to an end here. So Price is a Nightmare. I showed you this chart already where you can look at the cost of this war. For the major nations involved, the Allies take by far the largest number. Hold on, wait. There you go. You can see it better. You can see that very grim pie chart. Allied civilians are the largest casualty group of any of them. 58% of all those killed in World War II are Allied civilians. You see Allied military, 25 million. And then the Axis, ironically, started the war. The Axis civilians only 4%. Axis military is 13%. Let you know of just the horrific nature of this terrible war. Nations that have the most casualties, you can see Russia just has a terrible number of civilian deaths, as you guys see there. China has even more civilian deaths, but we're not talking about China in this lecture, although just kind of for a larger context. But Poland, as you guys see, also has massive civilian deaths. Only Germany outnumbers Poland for civilian deaths, with the exception, of course, of the two giants, population giants, which is Soviet Union and China. So Poland is number 4, right behind Germany. I take that back. I read my own graph wrong. Polish deaths of civilians is number 2 by far. Total number of German deaths is number 3, but not German civilian deaths. So take a look at the number of Polish civilian deaths right here in this top chart. You can see how badly Poland and the Warsaw Uprising is just a part of the terrible loss of life, not to mention the Holocaust, above all, hitting Poland the worst, which will be probably get into next week, because in these past 2 weeks, we've been talking about more of the military history of World War II, a bit of the politics of it. We have not gotten into Holocaust, but we'll do that next week. And we are almost done with this lecture. So, okay. Significance of this conflict: humanity's greatest, bloodiest armed conflict by far. It's not even close. You guys just saw the numbers right there above, so I won't reiterate those. Genocide in Europe and Asia. In the context of Europe, this certainly is the case. You see examples of attempted genocide. Hitler's view toward Eastern Europe, as you guys know, is generally genocidal in the long term. If he didn't plan to do it in the short term, certainly in the long term, Hitler's general view is genocidal toward Eastern Europe. And certainly in small pockets, it was put into reality. The world is left exhausted and bitter and worn out, but a very divided world at the end of the war. Some of the great powers were long great powers. France, not a great power. Great Britain, not a great power. Germany, clearly not a great power anymore at that time, is just devastated, and that just leaves the United States and the Soviet Union. Korea will be divided. Of course, that's not really context for our class, but just for the larger context. Germany, of course, is divided. And the Cold War is sadly going to start shortly from the ashes of World War II. Fascism, though, one of the good outcomes of the war, fascism takes a major, major blow. I'm going to highlight this for you guys. If you wonder what does fascism really mean, not in theory, but what does it really mean, World War II is a wonderful but terrible, terrible laboratory of what fascism leads to. What does it lead to? It led to World War II. It led to millions upon millions upon millions of people dying, both in the nations that were attacked or victimized by the fascist expansionism, and ultimately the nations who were fascist paid a terrible price themselves as the host nation for what turns out to be, surprise, a very dark thought system. Communism will emerge from the war relatively intact and still appealing to many. Now, again, I would argue a very thoughtful person did not need World War II to let you know communism has a dark edge to it. Ask the Poles. Ask any Eastern European as the communists arrive and the Red Army arrives and they install communist puppet governments. But despite that, because as you guys know, communism is a utopian philosophy, communism always has a fallback of, yeah, things are rough right now, but we're going to a great glorious future, be much better, and that future is universal for all humanity. Whereas you guys know fascism, frankly, the hell with the rest of humanity, we only care about these guys right here, and that's us. So communism still maintained a strong pull for many. Although, again, I would argue for those who are more thoughtful, seeing the expression of communism under Lenin, but above all under Stalin, should have been a very bracing warning on, yes, maybe it's not as aggressively genocidal as fascism is, but whether unintentionally or not, communism is a totalitarian system as it's been practiced so far, and the outcome is also very dark. Okay, I think we're going to stop right there. I think that's enough of these lectures. There is so much more to all this. Those are German prisoners of war being captured, marched to the streets of Moscow late in the war. Many of these guys will never get home. But at least mercifully, that terrible, terrible war came to an end. We still live in the ashes and outcome of that war. And of course, there's much, much more to that war. And I leave it to you, your own reading, your own curiosity. This topic remains ever important. So I mentioned a lot of books to you guys and quite a few movies and TV specials that I recommend to you guys. I encourage you guys for extra credit and also just for your own healthy curiosity and perspective to pursue this topic more on your own time, and something you can do for extra credit for this class too. So with that, we're going to stop right there. Hope you guys all are well, and we'll see you next week as we get to the last kind of final chapter of World War II, in this case, the Holocaust. So take care, everybody.